avoidants are very different to people with dismissive avoidant attachment style. If you don't understand and appreciate the distinctions between them, you could waste years on the wrong person, believing that they're actually capable of changing. And if you make the mistake of miscategorizing the fearful avoidant as a dismissive avoidant, you may then not spend enough time trying to create intimacy with this person that you love and then move on before you actually should. So in this video, I'm going to help you understand the distinctions between the two so that you can make the right choices in your own relationship and heal yourself if you are so inclined. I'm going to, number one, explain to you how these insecure attachment styles actually develop on the attachment spectrum. Once you understand how they develop, I'm then going to share with you the 5 distinct differences between how fearful avoidants operate and how dismissive avoidants operate. If that sounds good to you, stick around because you are going to learn things that you've never heard before. By the way, my name is Renee Way. I'm the founder of the Feminine Woman blog, which has had over 50 million visitors. And for the last 16 years, I've been coaching women in dating, relationships, and in healing insecure attachment styles. Normally, I like to make videos with my husband by my side, and we love that conversational style of video. However, right now, he's actually away in Nepal hugging with one of our 3 boys. So it's just you and I today. Okay, so let's put the attachment spectrum up on the screen. As you will see, this attachment spectrum runs all the way from secure to what I call pure avoidant. So as babies, we all start off wanting and seeking out a secure attachment. And in doing that, we cry to activate our attachment system. When we activate our attachment system, our hope subconsciously, or just as a function of biological wiring, is to secure adequate or ideally above adequate care. Now this care can come in the forms of breastfeeding, rocking to sleep, nurturing in many forms, a mother or father or a caretaker singing to you. All these things help a baby feel safe. Now, as babies, if we are offered nurturing in those forms at least 80% of the time, chances are really good that we ended up securely attached. So, minimum 80% of the time, our cries were responded to. We develop not only a healthy self-esteem and a healthy trust that we can safely bond and feel comfortable and trust our caretakers. But we get given the most amazing resource that any human can receive, a secure attachment style that effectively sets us up to thrive in adulthood. However, some of us aren't so lucky. Now, as we move down the attachment spectrum away from secure, we hit anxious. How babies get there is when their cries are not responded to 70 to 80% of the time, but less than 70% of the time, roughly. It's a rough estimate. How does this happen in real life? Maybe your mother or father or both of them were too preoccupied with their own needs and couldn't reliably give you attention. This has the result of making you anxious about being abandoned and anxious about your ability to survive in an environment where nothing is predictable. And at this point, what you do as an anxious baby is you hyperactivate your attachment system. You effectively go from 0 to 100 at breakneck speed in order to secure attention from your caregivers. Oftentimes, however, anxious babies are rather inconsolable. Now, if your caretakers are actually able to build trust again and give you that sense that you are able to rely on their caregiving, then perhaps some of the time you can relieve those anxious attachment patterns. But perhaps the next week they return to inconsistent care and attention. Of course, you then hyperactivate your attachment system again. This is how you build an anxiously attached baby. Now, some babies are even more unfortunate in that they're not just given inconsistent care, but they are given also neglectful care. So they're given a mix of inconsistent and unreliable nurturing and attention, as well as being somewhat abandoned some of the time. This can happen if a baby is sent to outside care for extended periods where their cries for attention are just not able to be responded to. At that stage, you develop what is called an anxious avoidant, fearful avoidant, or disorganized attachment style. So you swing the pendulum from anxiousness to avoidance. You don't quite know what to do. Remember, you're a baby. You don't quite know how to secure care. And you also don't trust that care will come. So you're kind of stuck in this, I don't know whether anxious or avoidant is a good place to go. Now listen carefully. This part is important. If the fearful avoidant or anxious avoidant person spends enough time hyperactivating their attachment system, if they perceive enough threats and signals of abandonment, and these are often subjective, of course, and you'll know that if you've dealt with a fearful avoidant person before, they will then shut down their attachment system. They will deactivate for a time. And the reason is because their nervous system can no longer handle that hyperactivation. It's too much stress upon them. But of course, these fearful avoidants still actually have access to memories of being nurtured deep down inside. And because they have access to these memories, deep down inside, they still want bonding, but they just don't have the adaptive patterns to nurture their desire for bonding. So since we've gone this far down the attachment spectrum to fearful avoidant, we can safely assume that these babies had their attachment needs, their cries, responded to less than 50% of the time. Maybe even 40 or 30% of the time. Now, here's where it gets a little more complicated to understand in terms of fearful avoidance, but stick with me because I'll promise I'll make it simple and easy for you. When a baby receives inconsistent care, whether that be because they actually have a mix of outside care as well as home care, what happens then is that the care is not only inconsistent, but because they've already developed that high anxiousness, they actually then become more difficult babies back home for their mother and father. And these difficulties put even more stress on their mother and father, who may not have the available emotional or psychological bandwidth to just respond to their baby and offer them that sense of safety. So then it becomes a bi-directional feedback loop where not only has the baby began being neglected to a large extent, but because it has been neglected, it comes back to their caretakers more difficult. It doesn't come back to their caretakers after a day at daycare or preschool feeling like they're more secure. No, they come back rather angry sometimes at their caretakers. They come back rather fearful and scared because they feel like they've been abandoned. You can't kind of rationalize with the baby about them being not abandoned, at least not until they're 3 years old. And so because they already perceive that they're going to be abandoned, they've lost so much trust that they're not entirely sure that they should even go back to hyperactivation. Therefore, the fearful avoidant can spend varying amounts of time in this avoidant state until they finally activate again. Now, something else very important to recognize about fearful avoidance is that the care that they do receive tends to come in abusive forms. Now, this is not universally true, it's just often true. When you experience abusive care as a baby and a toddler, you then incur an even larger and stronger attachment trauma. And let's say, for example, as the fearful avoidant baby, your mother is actually much better at nurturing you than your father. So what happens is you may develop a rather anxious attachment style to your mother, but a highly avoidant attachment style to your father. And as a baby, you store all these memories. And those memories are in a disorganized fashion in terms of attaching to other humans. This is why they're constantly swinging the pendulum between anxious and avoidant. Now, what happens with that pendulum swing is they end up in freeze mode a lot more. And this is why they can be so difficult to deal with. Now, let's get clear on the dismissive avoidance patterns. The dismissive avoidant baby learned very early on that hyperactivating their attachment system wouldn't work. Now, I want to be clear here. The dismissive avoidant did go through hyperactivation. As a baby, they did go through anxiousness. But what they learned is that that anxiousness is just useless and a waste of their energy. So instead, they deactivate their attachment system. And here's what deactivation actually looks like. It looks like not expressing emotions and completely minimizing them in order to maintain proximity physically to your caretakers for survival. And I really want to be clear with that word, survival, for nothing else but survival. So you learned to prioritize survival over any human attachment or human bonding. Now, once a baby's attachment system is repeatedly deactivated, they grow into a child and then an adult who learns to minimize emotions. They minimize vulnerability. And the longer they spend in deactivation, the more likely they are to stay there permanently. Now, I want to be clear here. The attachment spectrum is a sliding scale. What this means is that it's possible that there are dismissive avoidants out there who still retain, say, 10% anxious attachment patterns. And then again, there are dismissive avoidants out there who don't actually seem to really maintain anxious patterns, but they have the capacity to go there with enough deep work. Now, I'm not saying that you should do that deep work with them. However, it is a possibility that maybe you can ignite some level of attachment desires and a desire for bonding in them. However, of course, their defensive mechanisms against the lack of nurturing usually are far too strong to make those moments of anxiety significant. There are many dismissive avoidants who err on the extreme end of the attachment spectrum where they just are no longer capable of going to anxiousness. Now, I'm of the belief that there is another group of people on the absolute extreme end of avoidant. Just like there are highly securely attached people, bless their souls, there are highly avoidant people. I would call them pure avoidants. These pure avoidants retain no capacity for anxiousness. In fact, they are emotionally flat. They have what is called emotional blunting. And because they have emotional blunting, they don't even know what attachment and bonding feels like. Therefore, they can't perceive value in attachment or bonding. So when you try to go and create intimacy with them, you're essentially speaking a foreign language and expecting them to just learn it on the spot when they have no references for what this foreign language even sounds like. And at that point, the suppression of their attachment needs has become so strong that they've also suppressed any possible memories that you can access for healing. Because remember, the human attachment system is largely developed fully by our second birthday. It's very hard to go back and access any memories that make it possible to heal. Now I want to talk about the 5 core differences between the fearful avoidant and the dismissive avoidant. So the first core difference is that fearful avoidants swing the pendulum a lot more between anxious and avoidant. Whereas the dismissive avoidant stays in deactivation. Some of them will stay in deactivation, say 90% of the time, but the majority of them will remain deactivated in their attachment system. So on the surface, the dismissive avoidant is going to seem like they're more grounded or more consistent. However, the trauma that you experience from dealing with a dismissive avoidant can be highly like the trauma that you experience through dealing with a narcissist. Let me explain why. It's because when you fully deactivate your attachment system, you no longer see human relationships as a place to go to bond, to share resources, and for mutual love. You are much more likely to treat human relationships as a place to go to take. And you can tend to treat people as a place to go for supply. This is because without activation of the attachment system, what is left? And the answer is mostly transactional relationships or zero-sum games. So just because the dismissive avoidant seems consistent, they are consistent in their maladaptive patterns. This doesn't mean you'll be any less traumatized by dealing with the dismissive avoidant. Now, the fearful avoidant, because they have access to anxiousness, may actually be able to bond with you to some extent. They may even be able to fall in love with you. However, they don't have the necessary patterns that allow them to nurture their relationships. Fearful avoidants don't always thrive in relationships unless they do the work to heal and unless they are with a securely attached person who fully appreciates what they are going through. If the person the fearful avoidant is with cannot hold space for their terror of intimacy, it's going to be very hard to bring that fearful avoidant towards anxious and then eventually earned secure. So the fearful avoidant arguably needs a much more stable, understanding, and super sympathetic and compassionate partner in order to eventually come around and learn to enjoy and stop sabotaging emotional intimacy. The second core difference is that the fearful avoidant attachment style is correlated with a freeze response in the nervous system, whereas the dismissive avoidant is correlated with a flight response. Now, these correlations mean that when you're dealing with the fearful avoidant, the chaotic nature of their nervous system makes them freeze. Remember, the fearful avoidant as a child very likely had to deal with some form of abuse. If it wasn't abuse, it was highly inconsistent and unreliable care. And this unreliable care often comes in the form of abuse. Now, the fearful avoidant baby could have had narcissistic parents. They could have had one narcissistic parent. Now, one narcissistic parent is more than enough to make you so fearful of intimacy that you cannot trust yourself to relax and bond. Think of it like this. If you were so traumatized that you didn't trust your capacity to fight, yet at the same time, you couldn't trust your capacity to flight, meaning you were a child and you relied fully on your parents, on your caretakers, therefore you couldn't fight. Otherwise, you'd be in more trouble. Then what you learn is that you have to go into the freeze state. And so it's extremely hard for the fearful avoidant to seek out intimacy and to healthily trust the process of bonding with you because they need to reserve energy for that freeze state. Their nervous system is far too busy maintaining the freeze state for the sake of their survival. So you really have to wait until the fearful avoidant goes back into anxiousness, and you kind of need to use that window of anxiousness to reach them, to soothe them, to make them feel like how they are is okay. They are not broken. They are exactly where they need to be right now. And if you do this long enough, with enough repetitions, the fearful avoidant will eventually come to spend a lot more time in anxious preoccupation. Now, this is healthier, a lot healthier, than being in so much anxiousness that you have no choice but to switch to deactivation avoidance. Of course, the dismissive avoidant is far more likely to just flight, because they minimize emotions altogether or don't even understand them or appreciate the value of them. When conflict comes up, for example, you want to talk something through with them. Not only does their non-existent self-esteem not support you reaching out in that way, they have spent so long minimizing vulnerability that they no longer feel capable of meeting you where you are at. Core difference number 3 is that the fearful avoidant has greater access to cognitive, emotional, and compassionate empathy than the dismissive avoidant does. The dismissive avoidant tends to only use cognitive empathy. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The fearful avoidant has had the ability or the privilege to go to anxiousness and to hyperactivate their attachment system, which means they've had many experiences of themselves magnifying their emotions in the past. This is what anxious attachers do, right? It's the more dramatized behavior. It's not their fault. That's just how their nervous systems are wired. But because the fearful avoidant has the ability to go to anxiousness, they have more access to deep emotions. And because they have more access to deep emotions, they have more memories of feeling. And because they can feel, therefore they have more ability to have the not only cognitive empathy, but emotional and compassionate empathy. Now, when I say they have the ability, I really mean the ability. They have the capacity. However, what we have to remember is that fearful avoidant attachment is still a maladaptive attachment style. And because of that, that if you sit down with a fearful avoidant and you tell them that you're disappointed, you're hurt, you're angry, you're sad, what happens is that there is a high risk of them experiencing and feeling your emotions, having that empathy, the emotional and possibly compassionate empathy. However, because they can't regulate their own emotions very well, they are then at risk of being flooded by your emotions. And therefore, because they can't regulate their own emotions, they make it about themselves again. This obviously isn't their fault. It's just a function of a faulty attachment system. So what I'm saying is, even though fearful avoidants have greater capacity for empathy, it's not always the most reliable or greatest empathy, but it's there. And it becomes more and more reliable as the fearful avoidant heals. Now, for dismissive avoidants, they tend to only have access to cognitive empathy. This is for obvious reasons, because they don't allow themselves vulnerability. In fact, I don't think a lot of them even know what that truly feels like. It's just not what they go to. Because it's not their equilibrium, it's very hard to feel someone else's emotions if you have no memories or associations of having your own emotions. And that's why dismissive avoidants are also not the most reliable in terms of nurturing if they ever have children. Core difference number 4 is that dismissive avoidants tend to see others negatively and themselves positively, whereas the fearful avoidants tend to have this pattern of both seeing themselves negatively and others positively, especially when their nervous system is in that freeze state. It's kind of like having your foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. Because remember, the anxiously attached people of the world tend to see themselves negatively and other people positively. So if they're in a relationship with someone, a romantic relationship for example, they'll see themselves negatively and see the other person positively. However, dismissive avoidants tend to see themselves highly positively and other people negatively because they just have no trust in humans. I've known people who have met and fell in love with a fearful avoidant who also fell in love with them. However, later down the line, suddenly the fearful avoidant seems to turn around and go, no, I was all wrong about what happened then. I idealized the relationship way too much and none of it was actually real. It was all just a fantasy because they've switched from the anxiousness where they tend to idealize you to the avoidant patterns now where they don't idealize you, but rather they see you negatively and they see themselves negatively. So they don't have accurate, objective judgment of the actual situation and the memories that they have of being with this person. For the dismissive avoidant, because they tend to stay in seeing themselves positively and others negatively, their equilibrium, their safe place or their secure base is compulsive self-reliance. Now, this compulsive self-reliance is like a hardened reverse form of secure attachment. Let me explain this as simply as I can. So when you're securely attached, you've got enough resources and nurturing in order to develop a healthy self-esteem, right? However, when you don't receive nurturing at all, you have to develop a defense mechanism against that lack of nurturing in order to feel safe and still maintain proximity to caregivers. So in order to maintain that proximity to caregivers, you can rely only on yourself. And it's because they go to this compulsive self-reliance that it is so painful and so difficult for anyone to trust them, to bond with them. Also, it's easy for securely attached people to project their own secure attachment onto avoidants, thinking, oh, they're just like me. They, we see each other positively. They've pulled away, but they'll be back soon, surely. Yeah, they'll be back soon. Well, that's not always the case because remember, they see themselves positively, not you. Now, the fifth and last core difference between fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant is that the fearful avoidant will perceive more threats to the relationship and to their safety in the relationship than the dismissive avoidant will. The dismissive avoidant may be ignorant to threats completely and just minimize them to the extent that you don't even feel like they care, or they may just not even notice any threats because they're not that deeply attached, and because they're not that deeply attached, they're not deeply emotionally attuned. And when you're not emotionally attuned, it's hard to be aware of what the heck is going on around you. It's hard to know whether John over there is trying to steal your girlfriend, right? And of course, there's always that possibility that the dismissive avoidant will end up feeling some form of jealousy or even envy when they're pushed to it, but often it is not a calibrated awareness or a calibrated response. Whereas the fearful avoidant, in those highly anxious states, they will perceive threats to the relationship almost at every corner. Because the anxious preoccupied has a more maladaptive and uncalibrated ability to appraise threats, meaning those things that the fearful avoidant perceives as threats will not be the same things that the securely attached perceive as threats. In fact, for the securely attached, those things may be just like, what? That's nothing. Whereas the fearful avoidant will be like, did you see the way that girl looked at you? And so if you're a secure person dating a fearful avoidant, you can end up feeling like you're parenting this person because why are they so scared of everything? And by the time you alleviate this fearful avoidance fears around the external threats to your relationship or the perceived external threats, you then start to maybe feel like, I can use this opportunity to be intimate with them, to get close to them. Well, it doesn't always work out that way, does it? The fearful avoidant may then very well go back to sabotaging the relationship and sabotaging any connection. Because remember, They never learned that attachment is safe. If you've grown up being mostly ignored or abused, what you learn is that you have to reserve energy for safety, not bonding. Now, if you want to find out exactly where you sit on the attachment spectrum and get a score for how secure you are, go and take my free attachment quiz. You can access the quiz at Renee's links. It only takes a few minutes, and I highly recommend you read through the explanation afterwards. At the moment, the quiz is women specific. We do plan to come up with a men's version of the attachment quiz in the future if the men are so interested in it. Let me know in the comments if you are. However, at the moment, it is women specific. Anyway, I hope you got some value from this video, and I will see you in my next one.